So today we're going to be talking about Neoclassicism. We've already talked about some of the different styles that appear during this period in history that we refer to as the Enlightenment, including the Rococo style, which as we know is really closely associated with the aristocracy, and Naturalism, which is really pretty much the opposite. We see this as being closely aligned with the writings of Voltaire and Rousseau. So Neoclassicism is a style in art, in painting, in architecture, and in sculpture, which draws its inspiration from the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. And it's really quite interesting. This was, largely brought about. One of the major things that really kind of created an interest, an impetus, really, towards reflecting on these ancient cultures was, in fact, the rediscovery of some lost sites. So during the 18th century, the ancient cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were rediscovered, and excavations began. And so this really captured the interest of the public at large. And of course, people have a tendency to kind of romanticize this a little bit, I think, too. But people look back at the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and looked back at this as being the pinnacle of ancient society. And as a result of this, the American Revolution and the French Revolutions and everything else taking place often identified with Greek and Roman values. And so these Roman civic values of loyalty and courage and Greek ideas about democracy become really quite inspirational to a lot of these new movements politically within the world. And we see this reflected in their choices regarding architecture, painting, and sculpture. So in terms of how this really reflects in the art specifically, we do see that within Neoclassicism, the style of Neoclassicism, we see a renewed interest in classical antiquity. And again, this is heavily impacted by the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum. These classical cultures provide a model for enlightened society and political organization. And again, these styles were really quite popular with the public. And we see that these are often associated with the movements, the political movements that lead to revolutions, such as the American Revolution against the English, and of course the revolutions in France. So the first artwork that we're going to discuss here is a painting by Angelica Kauffmann. And Kauffmann was actually a student of Sir Joshua Reynolds and one of the founding members of the British Royal Academy of the Arts. So she was a woman with a really distinguished career, was quite well known and quite well respected. The painting that we're looking at here by Kauffmann is entitled Cornelia Presenting Her Children as Her Treasures, also sometimes referred to as the Mother of the Gracchi. So a little bit about what you're seeing here. Cornelia, this woman who's represented here in this rather austere Roman setting, she was mother to a couple of important people, really. The two people we see here, the two children on the left, the two boys, are Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. And these two individuals, when they grow up, attempt to reform the Roman Republic in the 2nd century BCE. It doesn't go so well for them. But what we see here is these two young boys and also a younger daughter there, a girl. And Cornelia here is basically displaying her children. So you've got this other woman on the far right-hand side. She's holding up her jewelry. And so this is kind of interesting. She's showing her jewelry. She's holding it up and showing it to Cornelia here and basically saying, here, look at my treasures. Look at my valuables, my riches. And in return, Cornelia gestures to her children and says, well, these are my treasures. And so this is a major shift. This is something that's intended to really show a different type of expectation of morality, which again is aligned with these Roman civic virtues. And so this is a good example of kind of how these ideas politically and socially work their way into the arts. Now, Kauffmann still maintains some of the Rococo visual artifacts here. We still have the same kind of light and fluidity of form that we tend to see with the Rococo. But in terms of subject matter and message, this is much more aligned really with what we would expect to see with naturalism, and also certainly directly reflects Roman civic virtues. So if we had to pick one artist as being really the most important single painter of the neoclassical period, that would certainly have to be Jacques-Louis David. David becomes the official painter, really, of the Revolution and also later becomes the official painter to Napoleon, which is really kind of interesting because those are two very different job descriptions, I think. But David has kind of interesting background. So this is a guy who apprenticed to Boucher, who we talked about from the Rococo period, who was actually a distant relative of his. But they had very, very different temperaments and didn't really get along. And so David ended up going and studying with other people and ended up traveling to Rome. He won the Prix de Rome and traveled to Rome, studied in Rome, was actually really quite influenced by Renaissance and also classical art. So David wanted to create an art that really moved away from the Rococo. He was not interested in the Rococo ideas of style and frivolity. And so he creates a style of art or interprets really the neoclassical style and focuses really on Roman civic virtues, on realism, on dramatic compositions that still take on actually some of the moralizing concepts that we see from naturalism, but does so really in a very Greco-Roman manner in terms of the message that's conveyed. So the first painting that we're looking at here by David is the Oath of the Horatii, and this is a really famous painting that played a significant role in his career. And it really kind of epitomizes what neoclassical art is really all about. When we look at the Oath of the Horatii, you're seeing a group of three younger men anyway, standing on the left, and then a more mature man in the middle, and some women on the right-hand side. And what you're looking at here is a series of three sons swearing an oath to their father. And what they're swearing an oath on, really, on these swords here, is that they're going to go to battle, and they're going to either win or die. And the subject's kind of an interesting one. They're going to battle, they're going to fight for Rome. This actually is an image that predates really the Roman Republic. It's a much earlier story from Roman history. And it's a story that Pliny recorded about a contest between, a battle really, if you will, between Rome and Alba. And they decided to settle it with a contest between their most powerful, their most successful warriors. And so a group of three men from Alba and three men from Rome were pitted against each other in essentially mortal combat. And this was really kind of a challenge because not only did the men, not only they were facing death, but even if they were victorious, there were going to be really significant ramifications. One of the wives of these three Horatii brothers was a sister of one of the young men being sent from Alba. And one of the young men was actually also betrothed to one of the sisters of the men from Alba as well. So that there was kind of they were almost related families in that way. And so they were having to choose here between their honor and their courage and their civic virtue and their own personal despair. And so here we see this moment where these sons are swearing this oath to their fathers. And the young men in this image are shown in a way that represents this concept of virtue and strength and rigidity. Whereas the women here are shown as frail and despairing and emotional. And so it's intended to really show the triumph here of these civic virtues, of courage, for example, over emotion and over despair. And so this type of self-sacrifice is something that is really focused on when we talk about neoclassical virtues. And as a result, this painting is really clearly a demonstrative example of what neoclassicism is really all about. So the next image here, also by Jacques-Louis David, is the Death of Marat. And this was painted in 1793 and is one of a series of paintings that David did about martyrs, really, the martyrs of the Revolution. And one of those is only known to us today through a printmaking copy, really, and another one is unfinished. But this example here, the Death of Marat, was actually created and reproduced by David several times. He made several variations on it. And it's really the best known example of this series. But this is a good example of how David became really the official painter, if you will, to the Revolution. He was quite an active member of this, as well as being a sympathizer. He actually voted for the execution of Louis XVI. So he was, quite closely involved. But the man that we're looking at here, who's dead in the bath, as you can see, was a writer and a revolutionary by the name of Jean-Paul Marat. And he was actually a friend of David. Marat was assassinated in 1793 under some pretty suspicious circumstances. He'd been stabbed to death in the bathtub, and he was killed by a woman by the name of Charlotte Corday. So she was a member of a rival political faction, and she really kind of weaseled her way into his, into his house, into the bathroom here where he was stabbed. She'd sent him a letter, and you can actually see it there in Marat's hand. And the note is abridged in the painting. It's shortened, but the full note read, July 13th, 1793, Marie Anne Charlotte Corday to Citizen Marat. It is enough for me to be truly wretched to have a right to your kindness. I am being persecuted for the sake of liberty. I am unhappy, and that is sufficient to give me the right to your protection. And so, with this rather deceitful note, she got into his presence, got into his home, and then killed him. Marat, the reason he was in a bath, by the way, Marat actually suffered from a skin condition, and so he had to take these frequent baths. He had to basically soak in a bathtub on a regular basis. Spent most of his time really there because of this dry skin situation that he suffered from. But he's shown here as a martyr, and you can see the note in his hand, the blood in the bathtub, and one of the really interesting compositional devices that David uses here is this heavy, oppressive, empty space up above. And this is intended to really kind of sharpen our own sense of pain and outrage here. And so it's intended to really, stir up resentment and frustration, and really used as a tool within the revolution. So after the revolution, David actually found himself imprisoned for a period of time, but his wife was actually a member of the upper class of the aristocracy, really, and they managed to kind of reconcile. Once they reconciled, he did a series of paintings, actually one in prison in particular, which was intended to kind of reconcile with his wife. They had been divorced, by the way, and they were remarried. But this particular painting also kind of served to bring him back into the limelight, if you will. And as a result of his work, Napoleon recognized him as being a really, important and skilled painter. And so he becomes the official painter to Napoleon. So he comes out of prison and becomes the official painter to the emperor. And the image that we see here is a painting that David did, which is called the Coronation of Napoleon, which is actually really kind of an inaccurate description, because what we're really looking at here is the coronation of Josephine. Napoleon's already crowned. He's wearing a crown there, which, by the way, interestingly, is very much in the style of a Caesar, of a Roman emperor. So we have this enormous canvas. It's huge. It's 20 feet high and 32 feet wide. And by the way, there were two of them created. The one we're looking at here is the version from the Louvre. David actually painted a second version, which is located at Versailles, which is slightly different. Very, very similar, but has some minor differences. So the image that we're looking at here, the consecration really of the emperor and the coronation of the empress, is taking place in what had been known as Notre Dame Cathedral. Under the reign of Napoleon, it becomes known as the Cathedral of Reason, and so it's kind of interesting how that shifts and changes. But you can also see some other interesting things happening here. On the right-hand side, we can actually see the Pope seated. And the Pope is seated there, kind of gesturing with his hand, offering his blessing, if you will. And the truth is that this was kind of an artifice that Napoleon had David add later. He basically told him, I brought the Pope all the way here. You've got to have him doing something. And so he's gesturing there as if offering a blessing. But it's really kind of an interesting contrast. If we think back to, for example, Charlemagne. Charlemagne was, of course, crowned emperor in the year 800. And when Charlemagne was crowned emperor, he went to Rome and was crowned by the Pope, by Pope Gregory. And so what we see here is very, very different. In this case, Napoleon doesn't go to the Pope comes to him. And Napoleon isn't crowned by the Pope, but rather Napoleon crowns himself in the presence of the Pope. And this speaks volumes to the power shift that occurs here. The Pope is no longer a powerful individual offering their blessing in that case. He's really a casual observer. And that's a major change politically and demonstrates really the power of Napoleon at this period in time. Eventually, of course, Napoleon falls. And when he does, David goes into exile into Brussels. But he still remains for us probably the single most important painter of the neoclassical period. Some other interesting observations about this specific work, by the way, you can see in the background a central figure, a woman. It's actually Napoleon's mother. She wasn't actually present. She didn't really approve of Napoleon crowning himself emperor and didn't attend, but Napoleon had her added anyway. On the left-hand side, we can see Napoleon's brothers and his sisters, including Pauline Borghese, who we'll be talking about shortly. So here we have an image of Pauline Borghese, and this is a sculpture which was created by Antonio Canova in 1808. And it's a life-size marble statue, and as you can see, it's based very much in kind of a classical manner. But there's kind of an interesting, another scandalous story about this work. So Pauline Borghese was Napoleon's sister, and she was married off to an Italian prince, Camillo Borghese, a member of a very powerful, very wealthy family, but not so powerful when compared to Napoleon at this period in time. So Canova was commissioned to create this statue, this image of Pauline, and to do it in a classical manner. And originally the plan was he was going to create an image of her as Diana, the goddess of the hunt. But Pauline didn't want to be Diana. She wanted to be Venus and wanted to be portrayed in this very kind of sensual manner. And so she's sitting here holding this apple, the golden apple of Paris's choice, of his decision, his judgment, of Venus being the most beautiful. And of course, by proxy here, Pauline being the most beautiful. And so, resting in this pose of, on this couch. And so it's interesting because Pauline had actually created quite a scandal. It was rather well known in Rome that she was a little promiscuous, and that her husband was certainly not alone in terms of her affections. And so creating this very kind of sensual image of her was really quite controversial. But the prince couldn't really do much about it because it's the sister of Napoleon, so what are you going to do? But what he did end up doing was he ended up keeping the statue in kind of a sequestered wing off on one end of the house, of their palace. And it was really only visible by torchlight and then rarely seen. So, he kind of hides it away because it really is kind of, I guess, a mark of shame in that respect. So, but we do see here is an image that certainly recalls some of the technique and the content that we'd expect to see when we're looking at classical antiquity. And Canova has really done a tremendous job here of capturing some of those classical Greco-Roman stylistic tendencies that we associate with images of Venus or Aphrodite. So we'll shift for a moment here to architecture, and we're going to talk a little bit about a structure that bears some striking resemblance, you may note, to structures we've talked about in the past. So the building we're looking at here is known as the Chiswick House, which is located close to London. It was started in 1725, designed by Richard Boyle. So the image that we have here, it's associated most closely, really, with Palladio. And with his Villa Rotunda. And of course we know that Palladio in turn was influenced by Vitruvius. But this is an interesting structure because it's intended, the neoclassical style in England, as with other locations, other places, is intended to be associated with the various democratic reforms and also with the strength of Roman rule. But it's interesting, the choice here, rather than being based on a Roman or a Greek example, is based upon a Palladian example, which of course, as we know, is an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation, and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of an interesting observation to note that when we're talking about the neoclassical style, it's very rare that we're talking about an architect who's really honestly looking at and interpreting the original source material. More often than not, we're talking about people who are influenced by people who were influenced by, etc., etc. So this also has a parallel in the United States. The image that we're looking at here, of course, is Monticello in Charlottesville. And this was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson actually was the minister to France, and he studied a lot of the architecture that he saw there quite closely. He studied French architecture. He also studied Roman architecture. He saw examples such as the Maison Carrée, which we've talked about previously, and was heavily influenced by these, as well as by the work of Palladio. And his influence there, the things that he saw, really had a significant impact in what becomes our national architecture. He ended up remodeling his Georgian-styled home when he returned to the United States from France into a structure that we see here, which really, of course, bears some striking resemblances to both the Villa Rotunda by Palladio, as well as the Chiswick House that we talked about a moment ago. Now, if we look at the plan view here of Monticello, we can see that it really does differ quite a bit from Palladio's Villa Rotunda, and that it's not really a central plan building. It's bilaterally symmetrical, but other than that, it doesn't maintain that same radial symmetry. That said, of course, the overall elevation of the image, the outer structure, certainly bears some very striking resemblances. Jefferson also really had a significant impact in his choices for architects for other projects. He chose an architect by the name of Benjamin Latrobe to design a new capitol in D.C., and this was very much classically inspired. He actually had them redesign. They created a series of new ideas really as well. Like, for example, the Corinthian columns were kind of updated so that rather than using acanthus leaves, the volutes that are covered with the foliage, in fact use corn, which is much more in keeping, of course, with an American theme. But otherwise, the structure here, as you can see, bears resemblance to quite a few earlier examples. And of course, this Capitol building we're looking at here was destroyed. It was burned. But what we see here is an image that bears some resemblance to even to Versailles, with its parallel blocks here, like the wings that extend outward from the sides. A tremendous amount of Palladian influence, as well as a variety of other classical derivations that we can see if we look carefully. So an interesting work of sculpture that we can look at here, created by an American artist, is entitled Forever Free. It was created by Edmonia Lewis. This work was actually created just 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's really quite relevant. Edmonia was actually born to a Chippewa mother and an African-American father. And the image here, of course, as we can see, represents an African-American, a slave, really breaking free from the bonds of slavery. And it's interesting, Edmonia actually traveled to and studied in Europe, specifically in Rome, and really learned and studied in a classical manner. And we see that, of course, reflected in the style of her work. One kind of interesting observation about this, too, so this work, while the content, the message really closely aligns with the plight really of African Americans at the time and slavery, etc. The style, the vocabulary which is used to convey this is still very much, traditional white European. And it isn't really until the Harlem Renaissance in the Americas that we see that really shift and change in terms of, the use of an artistic vocabulary within the African American culture that is more closely aligned with things that are demonstrative in their own culture and history, as opposed to, of course, aligning with European classicism. So a final example that we're going to look at here is, of course, of George Washington, and this is a life-sized image statue of George Washington, which is carved from Carrara marble. There's some other interesting things happening here too. He's got a cane in his right hand. His left hand there is resting on this tall bundle of reeds. It's kind of like a column. It's actually something called a fasces, which is a symbol associated with Rome. And so this is an image, of course, that reflects the Roman Republic. Some other symbolisms that we have here. We can see he's got a cape and a sword, and behind him at his back is a plow. And so all of these refer to a variety of different concepts, agriculture and of course the military power of the Americas, etc. And he's also shown wearing his military uniform, which is kind of interesting. Today, when we talk about images of Washington or other founding fathers, we tend to think of them in contemporary garb that they would have worn at that period. But it's actually interesting. There are images of, for example, Washington rendered as a Greek god, images of him really as Zeus. And so, he preferred to be rendered in a more realistic fashion with what he actually would have worn as opposed to in a toga. But there are examples of neoclassical, rather, sculpture and imagery from the Americas that render our founding fathers in really a more Greco-Roman fashion, which is kind of interesting. This statue was actually commissioned by the Virginia General Assembly in 1784. They actually looked at sketches from some artists, some local artists, if you will, but based upon those, they decided they wanted to hire out. So they imported a French artist, a famous guy by the name of Jean-Antoine Houdon. And so Houdon actually traveled to Virginia with Ben Franklin and came from France, went to Virginia, and while in Virginia, he stayed at Washington's home, measured his arms, his legs, took a cast of his face, did a variety of things to make sure he got everything absolutely dead on and accurate, and created the marble original that we see here. This one today resides in the rotunda of the state capitol in Virginia. And so this is, a great example, of course, of how neoclassicism really manifests itself both in our national sculpture and national architecture. And we can see examples of that clearly today if we look at things like the Lincoln Memorial, if we look at the White House, if we look at our Capitol in Washington, D.C., and many state capitals, of course, as well, still really clearly carry influence from these ideas that were brought back by Jefferson. And of course, as a result, carry back the ideas of Palladio and Vitruvius and a variety of other historical sources.